Day, as has been the pattern now for several days, we're getting less news from the Ukrainian battlefields over the last 24 hours. I suspect that to a great extent, the ability of either side to undertake advances has been affected by the weather. We are, however, getting some news. There's been increasingly heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force of Vuhledar. The Russians appear to be systematically destroying the high-rise buildings in Vuhledar, which have been acting as observation points for the Ukrainian military and which have been, up to this point, crucial for the Ukrainian defense of that town and strategic point. And there continues to be lots of reports about very heavy fighting in the Crimea Svatovo area, which, as I said previously, is difficult to understand fully because of the dearth of reports that come from there. There's also reports of fighting in Marinka and of further Russian advances in the Avdiivka area, but again, the information is sparse, and it's clear that the advances are incremental, or if one prefers, slow. The main focus of the battle, or at least the part of the battle that is getting the principal attention for the moment, continues to be Bakhmut. And here we get more reports of further advances by the Wagner organization troops in Bakhmut. They appear to be gradually and steadily capturing more and more of this particular town. There's been a discussion of this, another discussion about the situation from various Russian sites. I'm going to read from one of them which says that the Russians control around, as of the 21st of May, in other words 3 days ago, controlled around 500 meters of the road that passes through Khromovo. This is a stretch of the road that they captured west of Khromovo. And we also hear that the Russians are actually pressing significantly on Khromovo itself. The report says that the road from Bakhmut to Konstantinovka, the one that passes through Ivanivska, cannot be used because of ongoing fighting in the immediate vicinity of the highway near Ivanivska. And it says that there's fighting in the southwestern quarters, that an area called the Garage Zone between Levanevsky and Tchaikovsky Street is now being contested, that the Wagner troops are approaching the MiG-17 monument area at the entrance to the city, and that the Ukrainians have lost all their main positions in the area of the railway tracks and the Bakhmut 2 railway station, and that the Russians have mopped out a large area in the south. They've also apparently captured and secured, this is the Russians, the Transit Hotel, and to the north of the big railway station, where the Ukrainians did attempt to carry out a counterattack. This counterattack was unsuccessful. And lastly, this report, as I said, it appears to be an aggregation of reports from various sources, says that in the northern areas of Bakhmut, the Wagner forces have taken control of, have advanced rather along Levanevsky, Oborony and Pobiedy streets, that they reached City Hospital number 2, and that they're storming the fortified strongholds of the Ukrainian 127th Territorial Defence Brigade and the 2nd Mechanized Battalion of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. We're also getting lots of reports of Russian missile strikes and airstrikes in the Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk area. And we're told that one of these airstrikes, I'm assuming this is the one on Konstantinovka, destroyed the headquarters of the Bakhmut operational grouping. So that's a sort of rundown of events. From the Russian side, there's not been much from the Ukrainians, but there was a report from the Spanish newspaper Mundo, which claimed that Ukraine has now pulled out most of the troops in Bakhmut. We've heard that so many times. And that the remaining part of Bakhmut, still under Ukrainian control, is defended by only a few brigades. What is a few? Is it 1, 2, 3, 5, 10? No one says. And of course, how big are these brigades? A brigade in the US military can number up to 5,000 men. But are these brigades up to that level of strength? Or, as it seems to be much more likely, are they well below strength? Is it the case, as some have even suggested, that some of these brigades have now been reduced to just a few hundred men, with most of the others either dead or wounded or captured or retreated or fled? Who is to say? These are difficult reports, as I've said, to assess. Prigozhin himself, by the way, has again been out and about making comments. He seems now confident that Bakhmut will indeed be captured. He seems to be discounting the possibilities of any Ukrainian counterattack in the Bakhmut area. He has said that he expects the Ukrainian counteroffensive to begin once Bakhmut falls. He doesn't give any kind of precise timetable for that. And very disturbingly indeed, he says that he's now given instructions to Wagner troops in Bakhmut to take no prisoners, allegedly after he saw a film of Ukrainian troops murdering a Wagner soldier. Well, I consistently refuse to comment, to the extent that I can refuse to comment, on atrocity stories from this war. As I said many times, without independent investigation, I consider all such stories to be inherently unreliable. But I would say that I do hope that the actual military commanders of the Wagner organization disregard this instruction, if it is an instruction, from Prigozhin, and continue to take prisoners, because, of course, it would be straightforward murder if Ukrainian soldiers tried to surrender and were killed instead. I think that point needs to be made. Anyway, the one thing that is clear, at least to me, from the fighting in Bakhmut is not just that the Russians are continuing to advance inside the town, which they are, 2 or 3 blocks per day, but that the road that passes through Khromovo remains cut. The Ukrainians did try, clearly, to counterattack, to dislodge the Russians from the road, but as of the time of making this video, they have not succeeded. The reason I can say that with confidence is that I am sure that if they had succeeded, if the Ukrainians had indeed succeeded in pushing the Russians off the road, there would have been reports about this, both on Ukrainian channels and in the Western media. The fact that up to this point I've seen no such reports suggests to me that all of these counterattacks have failed, and in fact I am confident of that. So, the very severe operational crisis, what Prigozhin and others call the operational encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, continues. Now, once again, there are lots of reports about the enormous losses that each side allegedly is suffering in this fighting. And there's no doubt at all that the Russians are taking some losses in the fight for Bakhmut, though given that we're told that the Wagner troops who are spearheading the assault in Bakhmut themselves number 6,000, some of the reports about the Wagner forces taking losses numbering in the thousands, by definition, simply cannot be true. By contrast, our old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Marochko of the former Lugansk militia, is claiming that Ukraine has suffered what he says are irretrievable losses, dead and severely wounded, of 4,000 men in a single week. I don't know where he gets that figure from. I am sure that is an overstatement. I've not seen any other agency in the Russian government make such a claim. But nonetheless, it's clear that the Ukrainians are suffering very heavy losses indeed. Meanwhile, I understand that Zelensky himself has come out once more and said, this time in public, that Bakhmut must be defended. I suspect that far beyond any tactical considerations now, this has become a matter of very great political importance to him. The loss of Bakhmut may very well trigger something of a loss of confidence in his leadership, given how much he has invested in retention of this town. So I suspect that this is partly the reason why he is insisting on Ukraine clinging on to Bakhmut in this grim way. And I would also say that perhaps partly because of the intense pressure that Ukraine is under in the fighting in Bakhmut, and partly also, I suspect, because of the sense of impunity and encouragement that is coming from the support of the West, we're seeing over the last few weeks a steady escalation, or if you like, exacerbation in Ukrainian political behavior, anti-Russian political behavior. And I have to say that I'm starting to find, well, I haven't started to find, I do find much of the reporting about this in the media, particularly parts of the British media, extremely disturbing. Anyway, we all know about the crisis with the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the standoff which continues at the Petraeus Lavra in Kiev. There's now been a further announcement by Zelensky that he's now going to pass an edict basically changing all the names and in Ukraine to distance the country from Russia. All of this, as I said, an exacerbation of policy. But what to make of a title like this in The Guardian? I'm not going to read the whole article, but what to make of an article like this? Russian-speaking Ukrainians want to shed language of the oppressor. They want, in other words, to stop speaking Russian. Ukraine is pursuing a policy of trying to eradicate the use of the Russian language as much as possible in Ukraine. But it's now being suggested in The Guardian that this is voluntary, that the people in Ukraine who are Russian speakers are actually welcoming this. Is this remotely plausible? Is it really likely that people are happy to be forced to give up their birth tongue would The Guardian be reporting this if it were in this way, if it were happening somewhere else? I just ask these questions. They're rhetorical questions because on the last point, I can emphatically and categorically say that The Guardian would not be reporting it in that kind of way. It's all disturbingly familiar of other discriminatory actions taken in some states, including the United States and Britain, during periods of conflict, Germany, Japan, Italy, other countries like that, during the various world wars. Only it appears to go an awful lot further. And I have to say that this kind of reporting from entities like The Guardian really shocks me, perhaps more than anything else that I have seen. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss this further. I think people are entitled to form their own views. I think I've clearly signalled what mine are, both about Ukrainian practice and about the way in which it's being reported and the way in which The Guardian seems to be cheering this practice along. Anyway, let's move on. Situation on the battlefront is as I've described. The Russians continue to push forward in Bakhmut. There was a big Ukrainian combined sea and air drone attack on Crimea overnight. And importantly, it seems to have been a complete failure. From what I can understand, not a single drone got through and hit its target, either air-launched drones or seaborne drones. These drones that Ukraine is supposed to have put together by itself. Others suggest, by the way, that they got some help from Britain to put them together, perhaps the United States. I'm not going to get into that discussion. But anyway, there was a drone attack principally on Sevastopol, the big Russian naval base in Crimea. And as I said, it seems to have been a complete failure. Now, I say a complete failure. There are some suggestions that its real purpose was not to strike any targets in Crimea, but to get a better sense of Russian air and missile defences. I've been hearing this said now since the first Ukrainian drone attacks on Crimea, which took place way back in the summer. All I will say is that if the Ukrainians are launching these attacks with the intention of getting a sense of Russian air and sea defences, then the logical conclusion must be that the defences, the air defences and the sea defences, are getting better, are getting denser. Because just as Russia seems to be increasingly successful in shooting down HIMARS rocket systems, just as Russia seems to be increasingly successful in intercepting and blocking other Ukrainian devices. I mean, there's been repeated Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian territory. Increasingly few of them are succeeding in getting through. And we see the same pattern now starting to repeat itself in Crimea. We had that article a short time ago in The Guardian, which said that Russian electronic warfare jamming systems are proving increasingly effective in jamming Ukrainian drones. And we get the sense, we've also had reports from Politico that the Russians are increasingly succeeding in jamming GPS signals for American JDAMs bombs provided to Ukraine. Apparently they're not proving particularly successful. They're able to jam, or at least to a great extent, they're able to jam GPS signals to HIMARS missiles, even Excalibur shells. And all these attacks on Crimea, it seems to me, are doing is confirming that these attacks, these Ukrainian attacks, are being successfully repelled. Now, before I press on with this, I would say that, of course, there is the other side of the picture. The Russians regularly carry out drone and missile strikes on Ukraine. The Ukrainians historically have repeatedly claimed that they managed to intercept most of the drones and most of the missiles. I've been skeptical about these Ukrainian claims. Should I exercise comparable skepticism about the Russian claims that all the drones that have been launched against Crimea have been intercepted? Well, I think that there is a difference. What the major reason why I'm skeptical about Ukrainian claims to have intercepted all the drones and missiles that the Russians launch, or at least the great majority of them, is because after every big drone and missile strike, there has been extensive evidence of damage, significant, heavy damage to Ukrainian facilities. Whereas, in the case of this latest drone and missile attack on Crimea, so far as I can see, there has been no evidence of any damage on Russian facilities in Crimea at all. So all the evidence points to the Russian air defense system becoming increasingly successful, having ever greater success shooting down Ukrainian missiles, jamming Ukrainian precision-guided bombs, slowly degrading Ukrainian strike capabilities. A steady incremental improvement since the summer, when, for example, the HIMARS systems first started to be used and the drone strikes first started to occur. And this must also be, one would assume, a matter of concern to Ukraine and its sponsors. That, by the way, brings me back to the question of the state of Ukraine's air defences. Now, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done another very, very interesting programme about the capabilities of the Russian Air Force and what it's been doing and what it can do in the future conflict in Ukraine. Now, I just make a number of further observations. Firstly, The Economist tells us that the bulk doesn't exactly give figures, the bulk of the MiG-29 fighters recently supplied to Ukraine from Poland and Slovakia are inoperable. They are not in flyable condition. Most of these fighters are therefore having to be cannibalized in order to keep the few remaining MiG-29 fighters operating. That does not sound very promising. There are also reports that even some Ukrainian pilots are now skeptical about the idea of integrating the F16 quickly into Ukraine's air defense system. Again, Brian Beletic has talked about this extensively. It will take perhaps a year to train Ukrainian pilots to the level of proficiency needed to operate these types of fighter jets effectively. They could operate them up to a point, but less effectively. And besides, the F-16 is hardly the magic bullet that some people say. I'm going to say this. General Milley is now talking about the Abrams tanks that are going to be supplied to Ukraine, the 31 tanks. He says that they're not a magic bullet either. He seems skeptical that they're going to change very much on the battlefields. And indeed, it's difficult to see why 31 such tanks are going to make a huge difference in a war where one side, Ukraine, needs to operate hundreds of tanks, and where the other side, Russia, according both to Western intelligence estimates and claims by Vladimir Putin, is operating thousands of tanks, with Putin recently saying that Russia is producing 1,500 entirely new or modernized tanks a year, with that number probably likely to increase. I mean, even if these American tanks really were the best tanks ever created, which they might be, though there might be reasons to doubt this, they are not going to be enough of them to make a decisive difference, and General Milley appears to be conceding this. And we're getting also other reports about the air defense situation. There's a report now circulating that, as well as the fact that these MiG-29 deliveries from Poland and the Czech Republic, Slovakia and other places, proving to be less than what we were initially led to expect. There's been suggestions that the same thing is happening with the air defense missile systems that Ukraine is receiving. Now, we're not getting many reports yet about what the Patriots are doing, but we have had a report that one delivery of air defense systems, a Hawk missile battery from some unnamed country, turned out to be a complete dud. The battery was inoperable. It came without the relevant guidance radar, and it seems that without this radar, the whole system can't function. And I've seen some suggestions that, in fact, the missiles are hardly in a state to be used as well. And one wonders whether this isn't becoming more of a problem. I read another report today that the ODYSEE point defense system used by Ukraine, this is a wheeled, mobile, Soviet-era air defense missile system used to protect ground troops, developed by the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s and repeatedly updated thereafter. Still operated, by the way, in heavily modernized form by the Russian military. Anyway, Ukraine has run out of missiles for this particular system, Russian Soviet-era missiles for this particular system, so that they've had to shop around for alternatives, and the best that they've been able to find are missiles which they've sourced in Jordan, but these missiles apparently are not very good. They are inferior to the original missiles that the Ukrainian ODYSEE system used to use, and that, of course, those missiles, of course, are far inferior to the heavily modernized missile systems that the Russian ODYSEE systems work with. And we're getting more and more reports like this at sort of every conceivable level, that these Western weapons deliveries have proved a big disappointment for Ukraine. And that might explain a really quite astonishing tweet by Ambassador Melnik, or I think he's actually Deputy Foreign Minister now. I believe he was ambassador to Germany, if he's the same man that I think. previous Ukrainian ambassador to Germany was a gentleman called Melnik, and this is Foreign Minister Melnik. Ambassador Melnik, whilst he was in Germany, was so aggressive and rude about Germany that even the Germans began to become exasperated with him. Anyway, Ambassador Melnik, or Foreign Minister or Deputy Foreign Minister Melnik, has now come out and said that Ukraine does not have enough weapons to defeat Russia, and it needs far more weapons from the West. It needs the West to agree to cross all its red lines. That is a very interesting comment, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. All of its red lines. They've got to supply Ukraine to the level, with weapons, to the level of 1% of their GDP. 1% of the West's aggregate GDP to supply weapons to Ukraine. I mean, this is an astonishing demand. Apparently it's made with a straight face, and it's been repeated apparently by other Ukrainian officials. There's been a comment by a Ukrainian official in Kharkiv region, who supposedly is now coming out and saying that Ukraine will never get enough weapons from the West to defeat Russia, and that Ukrainian demands for weapons are limitless and endless. And while I'm on the subject of weapons, I should say something else. Like most people, I have assumed that even different variants of the Leopard 2 tank, the main Western tank supplied to Ukraine, there's apparently around 50 of them, give or take, that the various variants, that there are essential similarities between them. Apparently I assumed too much. It seems that some of the older variants of the Leopard 2 have a different 120mm gun from the later variants. It seems that the later variants of the Leopard 2 can fire the ammunition used by the gun of the earlier Leopard 2s, but the earlier Leopard 2s cannot fire, or at least cannot fire effectively, some of the ammunition used by the gun of the later Leopard 2. That's what I've heard. Now, I might be wrong about this. As I said, technical matters of this kind are hardly my province. But if that is correct, then we're going to have an even more jumble of Frankenstein weapons being assembled for this Ukrainian offensive. And we see all these problems starting to build up and accumulate at multiple levels. And anyway, there we go. It's not enough. Ukraine is saying it's not enough, what they've received from the West. There's reports in the West that it's not enough. There's talk about the West running out of money. The State Department is already apparently saying that the budgets for supplies to Ukraine are now almost exhausted. I would take all of those claims with intense skepticism. The problem is not money. And to repeat again, despite continued criticisms from Republican Congress people and senators about this blank check that's essentially been given to Ukraine, the problem is not that there's going to be a lack of money to continue to supply weapons and equipment to Ukraine. The problem rather is that there are now clear capacity constraints. The West cannot supply Ukraine with the levels of equipment that Ukraine says it needs. There are physical constraints, and they simply cannot be overcome in any acceptable time frame. And that is the fundamental problem. That explains why this summer offensive, as it is now apparently going to become, is being talked about by so many people as Ukraine's last big throw. There is simply nothing, or at least there is not enough to replace the equipment that would be lost in this offensive if it failed, or by the way, if it succeeded. The West lacks the means to re-equip Ukraine to the extent that it did last summer in preparation for the autumn offensives, and to the extent that it has struggled to do over the course of the winter following the massive losses Ukraine experienced over the course of those autumn offensives. Now, on the topic of those offensives, General Petraeus, the former director of the CIA, a person with strong neocon views, has said that the Ukrainian offensive is going to be as hard-hitting as hell. It's a kind of comment, I suppose, that American generals like to make. And he's now giving it a date in from mid-May to early June. And I think that might very well be correct. I said that if it had indeed been postponed by a month, then a June date is not inconceivable. As I've also said, the Russians would be foolish to assume that, and I am absolutely sure that they don't. Anyway, we will see what happens in relation to this offensive if it comes. But I'm going to just mention two further points about this offensive and the negotiations that now pretty much everybody assumes are going to take place after this offensive, whether it succeeds or fails, or it succeeds only to a limited extent. Now, there's a number of points I want to make, and they follow on from the video I made yesterday. The first is that it is a purely Western assumption that there will be negotiations after the offensive. The Ukrainians, at the moment, are continuing to reject negotiations. The Russians always say that they are open to negotiations, but to be frank, they're saying it with less and less indications that they really believe this to be so. There's been a lot of focus upon what China has said. Now, there were some extraordinary comments by the Chinese ambassador to France, which provoked something of a row. The Chinese ambassador to France basically seemed to say that as far as China is concerned, Crimea is now Russian. He pointed out that Crimea has historically been Russian, that it was transferred from Russia to Ukraine by a Soviet decision in 1954. This has created uproar. I can't understand why. It is a historical fact. All of that is true. But he also said, this ambassador also said, that the other Soviet republics, the various Soviet republics, didn't really possess proper sovereignty because of the somewhat chaotic way in which they emerged following the Soviet Union's collapse. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has had to produce a somewhat tepid statement appearing to contradict this. And it's been reproduced by the Russian TASS news agency, and this is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Mao Ning said. After the demise of the Soviet Union, China was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with the newly created countries. Since the inception of diplomatic relations, China has always adhered to the principle of mutual respect and equal treatment, whilst fostering bilateral relations of friendship and cooperation. China respects the sovereign status of the republics that were founded after the Soviet Union disintegrated. Now, what I find interesting about that statement is that though it appears to retreat from the comments of the Chinese ambassador, Mr. Liu Xiaoye, to French television, you actually look at it carefully, it doesn't exactly do so. First of all, it doesn't contradict him on the question of Crimea. Why would it? What Liu Xiaoye said about Crimea being historically Russian territory, transferred to Ukraine by a decision of the Soviet government in 1954, without, by the way, any consultation with the people of Crimea. Well, that is absolutely true, and there's no reason why the Chinese should deny that. But if we go to what Mao Ning is saying about the way in which the republics emerged out of the Soviet Union, she doesn't exactly say that Liu Xiaoye's comment that they emerged in a muddled way, that their sovereignty isn't really absolute. She doesn't actually say that that was wrong. She doesn't actually detract that. She says that China established diplomatic relations with these countries and has pursued policies of mutual respect and equal treatment, fostering bilateral relations of friendship, cooperation, and that it respects the sovereign status of the republics that were founded after the Soviet Union disintegrated. But all of those are rather pragmatic words. What Mao Ning is basically saying is, look, we weren't involved in the collapse of the Soviet Union. All sorts of republics then appeared. It's not for us to debate the rights or wrongs of that process. We just went along with it. We established diplomatic relations with the various countries that then emerged, and we've aimed to have good relations with all of them. But, fundamentally, the question of how that all came about is not one that we're going to debate or discuss at this point. I'm just making this point because I do suspect that Liu Xiaoye went way beyond what the Chinese authorities intended. I don't think he was flying a kite, for example, for the Chinese government. I certainly don't think that the Chinese government would want, at this point, to give the impression that China is calling into question the legitimacy of at least some of the republics that emerged out of the Soviet Union. After all, China has very good relations with some of them, such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, for example, and China would not want to jeopardize those relations. But I suspect that Liu Xiaoye's words do reflect an opinion that behind the scenes, behind the curtain, if you like, is probably fairly widely shared amongst the foreign policy establishment in China. China was not happy at all when the Soviet Union collapsed. They were dismayed by the collapse of the other socialist superpower that took place at the time. I remember when it happened that they published all sorts of commentaries blaming Mikhail Gorbachev for that collapse. Criticisms, by the way, which many, many Russians would share. Perhaps Putin himself would share. They clearly were unhappy with the whole process. They clearly were and remain uneasy about how the Soviet Union broke up. They probably, in many cases, deep down, do wonder about the reality, the real historical origins and antecedents of some of these countries, which appeared. And they're not prepared to say that at the moment. As I said, I think Liu Xiaoye was far out of line in what he said, but it might conceivably, in any relevant situation, affect Chinese policy at some point in the future. Now, saying that, I don't mean to suggest that the Chinese are looking or expecting or supporting a position where Russia starts to re-annex former constituent republics of the Soviet Union. All I am saying is that the Chinese are signaling that they will take what comes, or rather that the Chinese, maybe they're not signaling, but that they will take what comes. And if we start to get into those kind of situations, it will partly depend on how that process evolves, how it comes about. And in any event, for the moment, and indeed for the foreseeable future, for China maintaining the strong relationship with Russia remains the overriding priority. I'm not suggesting that the Chinese are going to give the Russians any sort of blank check, but as I said, I think what Liu Xiaoye did unintentionally was that it opened a window onto the Chinese mind. I think a lot of people in the West sense that, and I think that may explain in part the over-the-top reaction of some people to these comments. On that issue, I would say one thing. We've had all kinds of commentaries, all kinds of places calling into question the unity and territorial integrity of China, wondering whether some of the regions in the west of China should belong in China. These comments are almost made at a kind of official level, or something very close to an official level. There's now open debate in some of the more radical fringes of the foreign policy establishment in the West, the more neocon fringes of the foreign policy of the West, about the possible breakup of Russia following the lines of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Nobody is ever outraged by those kind of comments or expresses any sort of outrage about any of these kind of comments. A Chinese ambassador makes what looks to me like a Freudian slip, and the West goes nuts. That, by the way, tells us how differently the Western powers perceive themselves from the way they perceive others. It's not even a question, so it seems to me, of a double standard. The West conceptually doesn't seem able to understand that the way it deals with other countries is as offensive to those countries as when those countries do the same, as the West feels is the case when those other countries do the same to the West. I mean, when I'm still reading, for example, all kinds of articles in Western newspapers about Vladimir Putin's wicked use of the energy weapon against the West, as if it was the Russians who cut off gas and oil supplies to the West. But again, the assumption is that it's somehow illegitimate or wrong for the Russians to stop energy supplies to the West, even at a time when the West is debating imposing an embargo on the export of Western goods to Russia. Anyway, I'm not going to pursue this point any further, but there is one point about China and the Chinese position which I do want to highlight, because it goes directly to the question of what might happen if there were an approach from the West for some kind of negotiation after the Ukrainian offensive. Now, I'm going to assume in saying all of this that the Ukrainian offensive has failed to achieve the knockout blow that was perhaps at one time hoped. That is now the consensus, not just in Russia, but in the West itself. So what form would the negotiations take? Well, we saw a long article yesterday, which I discussed at length, by Simon Tisdall, a man who takes a very strong maximalist position supporting Ukraine. He discusses it in The Guardian. He's, I think, very much the guiding light of The Guardian's coverage of the Ukrainian war. But anyway, he spoke about the conclusion of the conflict, a settlement of the conflict, purely in terms of the internal arrangements between Russia and Ukraine. He spoke of what he thought of as a deplorable situation, where as part of an armistice agreement, if you like, the Russians retained control of Crimea and, as he put it, parts of Donbass. And he said that this would be seen as a betrayal by people in Ukraine. I've already said that I don't think that would be acceptable to the Russians, because the Russians will undoubtedly insist upon not just parts of Donbass, but of all of Donbass and the four regions, Kherson and Zaporozhye, because, well, they've already said as much, and it seems to me that from their point of view, that is a constitutional requirement. There is something else, and it's very important, and it's something where the Chinese have made it clear that they are fully aligned with the Russians, because it is all but inconceivable that the Russians would agree to any settlement of the Ukrainian crisis which is only limited to Ukraine. The Russians have repeatedly been saying for years now, and of course in December 2021, they actually proposed draft treaties, that it isn't just a question of Ukraine. There has to be a fundamental reform of the entire security architecture of Europe. In December 1991, they said that they wanted all US and NATO military facilities in all new NATO countries which joined the alliance post-1998 to be dismantled. They want all those military facilities to be retreated back, to be taken back to the original NATO borders which existed pre-1998. And besides that, they also wanted, as of that time, cast iron treaty commitments about the non-expansion of NATO. And of course, NATO is now talking about expanding in all kinds of places, in Central Asia, in the Arctic, even in the Pacific, in all sorts of places. They want no further Western NATO expansion. They want that all to be brought to a total stop. And in fact, they will want to have NATO restructured, at the very least, in order to basically make it less of a threat to themselves. It's restructured conceptually, I don't just mean militarily, and probably ultimately replaced by some kind of new security mechanism, European security mechanism, eventually replacing or superseding NATO, which will include Russia itself. Now, it is important, it is essential to understand that the Chinese back this Russian position. It is briefly touched upon, but in a way that makes it clear that it is an essential point in the Chinese 15 points about the conditions that need to be met in order to achieve peace in Ukraine. Those 15 points said that there needs to be equal security guarantees for all parties, including Russia, by implication. And what we know about the joint statement that China and Russia agreed over the course of Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow is that, amongst other things, it contains a specific provision about the need for NATO to remind itself of the fact that it is a purely defensive alliance, something which essentially means that it can no longer undertake out-of-area operations or aggressive actions like the ones in Yugoslavia or Afghanistan or potentially the Pacific or other places. And again, we can see how that is consistent with Russian thinking. So, if there's any attempt after the end of the conflict to play the Russians and the Chinese off against each other, to try to use the Chinese to push the Russians into negotiations which the Russians don't want over the conflict in Ukraine, saying to the Russians and to the Chinese, well, look, you can have bits and bobs of Donbass and bits and bobs of Crimea, at least at the moment, and that's all you're getting, and that's the end of the war. The Russians almost certainly will say no. China will support the Russians in saying no, because the Russians inevitably are going to say that apart from the importance of the demilitarization and denuclearization of Ukraine, the need to cleanse Ukraine of this radical ideology that exists in Ukraine, the need to secure Donbass itself, there is this overarching issue of security guarantees for Russia as well as every other country, and that will affect the status of NATO. Now, back in December 2021, NATO categorically refused to negotiate on any of this. So, let's assume that there is a Ukrainian offensive. Let's assume that it fails to achieve its more grandiose objectives, that it looks as if Ukraine and the West are locked into a war of attrition. It's all the indications are over time the Russians are going to win. Let's assume that the West decides to pick up the phone to the Russians at that point and say, let's talk peace. Let's, however, try to limit it to Ukraine. And let's assume that the Western powers approach China and say, back us on this, get your friends in Moscow to pull back. The Russians are, of course, going to say no, because it doesn't answer their concerns about Ukraine itself. They will sense that they're in a position of strength and advantage, but they will also undoubtedly bring up again those treaties that they proposed in December 2021, and they will have the backing of the Chinese in doing it. And not just, I suspect, the Chinese. A few weeks ago, about 10 days ago in fact, we published on the Duran a program that I did with Professor Glenn Deason, and the former Indian ambassador to Moscow. And it seemed to me that he too, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that he speaks for the Indian government, but he's probably in tune or familiar with thinking in Delhi. Anyway, he too seemed to think that Europe required a new security architecture and proper guarantees ensuring the equal security of all. And he too seemed to be, shall we say, skeptical of NATO ideas to expand in the Arctic, in Central Asia, in the Pacific, in all of these places. He spoke about how that would make NATO essentially an unworkable, certainly as a defensive alliance. So I think the Russians would be in a very strong position. And by the way, I remember going back to that famous or infamous televised Security Council session that took place on the 21st of February 2022, when the Russian leadership publicly debated whether or not to recognize the independence of the two Donbass republics. The Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Security Council, said that recognizing the republics and achieving what would eventually become the objectives of the special military operation. Obviously, it wasn't announced at that meeting, but it inevitably followed from it. Doing those things would ultimately put Russia in a stronger position to insist on the implementation, the acceptance by the West of the draft treaties that were proposed by Russia in December 2021. So I think that point all needs to be said. And as I said, on this, Russia will have China's backing and quite possibly India's too. And I suspect much of the rest of the world as well. I don't think this is understood in the West. Simply stopping now might not be as easy as some people in the West think. It might have been possible. In fact, it would have been possible if that draft agreement that was there on the table in Istanbul in March 2022 had been acted upon. But this time, now, I cannot imagine that the Russians will demand anything less than a restructuring of the security architecture in Europe. Now, before I finish this program, I'm going to say that I just want to repeat a point I just made a moment ago about how the West sometimes has difficulty understanding that things that it does to others are as offensive to them as it would be to the West if those things were done by others to itself. But we are now starting to see increasing contradictions to the point even of absurdity on the part of Western governments, and it does make me wonder whether the right arm fully knows what the left arm is thinking. So on the one hand, I've been reading reports that the Western powers are now debating an all-out economic blockade of Russia, an embargo on exports of all goods, Western-produced goods to Russia, apart from a limited number that will be set out in some kind of document and supervised by some kind of blockade committee, presumably. At the same time, I'm also reading that Western governments are now debating lifting swift restrictions on some Russian banks, replugging some Russian banks to SWIFT, and this supposedly is in order to facilitate the resurrection of the grain deal that was agreed in the summer between Russia, Turkey and Ukraine with the assistance of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, but which has never really worked properly, or at least because the Russians claim that the European Union has consistently reneged on its promises to facilitate exports by Russia of its food products and of its fertilizers. Now, which is it that the West is going to do? Are they going to, at one and the same time, cut off all exports of goods, Western goods to Russia, at the same time as they're reconnecting Russian banks to SWIFT? Do they not see the obvious contradiction in this? Softening the sanctions in one respect, toughening them in another. It all makes very little sense to me, but it's all perhaps a good example of the tangled and bizarre mess that the Western powers have now got themselves into. I'm hearing, by the way, more and more reports that demands for more and more sanctions are now facing really intense opposition from Western leaders, from Western businesses, that they're saying that this has gone as far as it can go. More and more countries and officials apparently sceptical that more sanctions can be imposed, but there we are. Now, there's one other thing I just wanted to finish up with, and this is some really bizarre comments from the EU Foreign Minister, Mr. Borrell. Mr. Borrell, I have to say this, is the most disastrous High Representative that the EU has produced in the limited time that such a personage has existed, and that's saying something. But anyway, he's come up with an absolutely harebrained idea about EU fleets patrolling the Pacific, and this has received snorts of derision in Beijing. But it could just possibly be the case that Borrell or somebody close to him, Macron perhaps, is thinking a little beyond the future. I said that the Chinese and the Russians are now insisting that NATO must, if it is to survive at all, go back into its box, basically retreat its military infrastructure to its 1998 borders, remind itself that it is a purely defensive alliance, give up these ideas of expansion in the Arctic, Central Asia, the Pacific, etc. Is it possible, just possible, that somebody is now thinking to themselves that maybe at some point that might happen? And could it be that Borrell is looking forward to that day when NATO does impose this restriction upon itself, in which case perhaps the way round that is to replace NATO with the EU instead and get fleets from the West appearing in the Pacific, but telling the Chinese and the Russians that it's all fine, even if they've agreed that NATO fleets will not appear in the Pacific because they're not flying under the NATO flag, but under that of the EU. Well, probably I'm giving too much credit to Mr. Borrell and people around him. I doubt actually that they're thinking that far. More likely it's another case of Josep Borrell's compulsive grandiosity. But who knows? Maybe, just maybe, somebody planted the idea in his mind because they're looking forward to the future that I've just said. Who's to know? Perhaps in time we'll find out. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Just to remind you, you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also go to our shop, buy yourself all the amazing things that you will, all the amazing merchandise that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.